This right here is my favorite thing ever in the history of forever.
Hello, you dirty potters. How are you today? Today I'm going to be answering a question that a lot of you have been asking me in my social medias, and that question is, how much water should I be using when I throw? Usually this question is the result of two different types of people. Number one, you're a beginner and you might have more of a mathematical brain. You might be thinking, okay, X amount of water equals X amount of time on the wheel, right? Wrong. That is the wrong. Or you might be centering and asking yourself, why is this getting dry as I'm throwing it? I put water on it. How much water should I actually be using per amount of time? The second kind of person is usually someone who's gotten past the centering phase and onto the beginner and sometimes even the intermediate phases. There are people who have to control the distribution of their water instead of just putting water on the clay body. While you're centering, there's pretty much only a ball that you need to put water onto to make sure that your hand hydroplane over the clay, causing a little bit of friction so that you can control the actual product. But when you're getting up into the cylinder stuff, things that are 5-6 inch cylinders or so, it's going to be a little bit more difficult as you can't really just put water on the thing you're centering and call it a day. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Unfortunately, the answer is different depending on your needs for whatever you're throwing at any given time. And in today's video, we're going to go over some of the examples and scenarios of how much water you would use in certain situations or even at a base level. Let's start off with the most common of those two, which is beginners and centering. If you're a true beginner and you haven't had much experience centering your clay, my answer to you is pretty easy because I'm willing to bet a good 60% of you are doing this.
No, don't do it!
Disgusting!
Okay, this right here, grabbing your sponge and just squeezing all the water on there at once before you center. See that? I need you to stop doing that immediately. Now I gotta clean up all the water mess I just made as an example. Didn't want to do that. This is something that I see all of the time. And I do understand that for real beginners, they seem to think more water equals more hydroplane, which equals less friction, which equals more time with my clay. So I should just add more water when I'm throwing, and that'll kind of fix all my issues, right?
No.
In fact, if you keep on adding that much water to your clay body, you're going to end up oversaturating it, which makes it, number one, way harder to work with when you actually start pulling a cylinder, and number two, can be a variable in causing S-cracks in your clay body. So before we go anywhere, I need you to stop getting your sponge, filling it with water, and just dousing your clay body with it as if it's going to help you. And not only does it not help you, it actually harms your clay in the process. I mean, it doesn't really harm the clay, it just kind of like makes your life way more difficult for you, actually. Okay, Donte, well, if I'm not supposed to do that, then how much water am I supposed to use? Are you ready for this? It's actually a very simple fix. What I want you to do is put down your sponge. Don't use it. Put your hands in the water bucket. Don't carry the water. Don't like grab some water. Just put your hands in the water bucket, let them go, and start centering. That's it. That's the entire thing. It's not that hard. You don't need a sponge. You don't need anything like that. And if you're coning up and down and you start feeling a little bit of friction and you notice a lot of that water is going away, here's what I want you to do. Hand in water. Don't carry it, just bring it to the clay body. And you'll see that it moistens the clay just as much as it needs to be in order for your hands to hydroplane over the clay body and for you to control your clay. In fact, I know I just told you to use two hands, but that's because I assume many of you are beginners. Usually, I just kind of leave this hand out here, and I just use one hand. Dip the hand in the water bucket, touch my clay body, and it wets everything up nice. You can actually kind of see the water disappear as I work, and if you start to feel too much friction and pull on your clay body, you can very easily release slowly, dip one hand again, and put it right back on, and it re-wets it for you. It's a very, very simple process when you're centering. There's no special technique required. All you really have to do is wet one of your hands and you're good to go. As I said before, if you really feel like you need more water, you can wet both of your hands. But usually, as you work with a clay body, and you can kind of see the shimmer from my clay body go away over time, it will start to dry out that water and spread it around and absorb into the clay body. This will create more friction, and when you feel too much friction and you let go, this one hand will spread the water, and you can see it kind of get wet there, to the rest of your hands. You don't really need two hands. Potter tip. This is something that I've addressed in previous beginner videos, but I feel like I should just readdress this here and now. Usually, as a beginner, you would want to wet your clay body, right, using the one hand, and then when you start to feel friction, let's say you need to let go, you want to stop your wheel, and then take your hands off, spin your wheel again, and then re-wet and continue centering. This is for a couple of reasons. Someone like me probably knows the timing in which they can take off their hand to get more water and then continue the job. But if you're a beginner, many times you take your hands off while you're spinning the wheel and something like this happens, where you don't really know the timing and you have to re-center again. You have to do one of these. So if you're having a little bit of trouble continuing to center while doing this, grabbing your water with your hand back and forth like this, I heavily suggest you stop your wheel, grab some water, spin, and then continue. It'll help you miles and miles, especially if something like this keeps happening to you. The second issue for most people who've progressed past the point of centering is deciding how much water you need in what areas and where to distribute water in order to get the maximum efficiency from your clay body without oversaturating the clay body itself. At this point, you probably already know how to throw a cylinder like this.
Me like this.
When you were centering, it was pretty easy. All you have to do was wet your hands, put some water on the ball, make sure there's not too much friction, and then continue centering, coning up and down, and sooner or later, you'll get a hold of it. But once you get into the end of the beginner, or at least the intermediate phases, you're gonna have to start distributing your water in specific places. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. After you pass the centering portion and you understand that you need minimal water in order to center realistically, putting water on a ball while you're centering or coning up and down, just carrying water over from dipping one hand in there and putting it on the ball is no longer sufficient. Once you get to the end of your beginner phase, you start to make good cylinders, you're going to have to start to think about the distribution of your water and where it goes based on where you're going to touch that clay body next. So if I decide to pull my cylinder one more time, this means I need to get my sponge in order to distribute water and put it on the inside of my clay body as well as the outside here, making sure the entire cylinder is wet so there's no friction while I end up pulling. This means that your old water tricks when you were centering don't exactly work anymore. You can't just get one hand, dip it, touch the clay body, and hope the entire thing's wet. You have to make sure the inner and outer of the cylinder is wet, so when you start to pull, you end up causing less friction, more hydroplane effect, and you have more control over your clay body. Trust and believe, if you start to pull without making sure this entire thing is wet on the inside and outside, you're gonna hit a dry spot and it's gonna twist on you because of friction. At this stage, you would actually have to put the water inside and outside of the cylinder. So you'd grab your sponge full of water, put your hand right here, crux it a little bit, touching the inside of your cylinder, just like this, and you would end up squeezing your sponge down your hand, and that, in turn, will touch the inside of your cylinder. As long as you keep on spinning, it'll distribute along the inside of the entire cylinder. You can do the same thing for the outside of your cylinder, but it's much easier than the inside. You put your hand on one part here, and you drip that water down your hand. While moving your hand down the clay body, this will wet the entire cylinder. This one does require a little bit more water because you now have a larger surface to put water onto. Before it was like this much clay, right? Wasn't that much. But now you essentially have to distribute this water among the outside and inside of your clay body to make sure it touches all of the surface. Once the inside and outside are properly lubricated, it's very easy to then pull. But trust and believe, if you do this without lubricating the inside and the outside with water, you will end up finding a dry spot, and you will also find yourself a twisty spot. You know, the not good place. A little trick here that has served me very well for many years is I get my sponge, fill it full of water, I put my hand on the inside with my thumb and the outside with my finger like this, making sure I'm touching with my thumb the inside and the outside with this finger here, and I will drip all the water while pointing downwards onto the hand itself. This will usually drip the water down my finger and my thumb and wet the inside and outside of my cylinder simultaneously. Now I don't have to play this game of like playing the crab game of making a claw and putting a thing here and then making a cup of water hand and then letting it go down the entire clay body. I don't have to do that. For years and years, I've just been putting my thumb and my finger and dripping it down my hand, and it takes care of the entire process for me. And finally, once you get into the more advanced stages of ceramic artwork, when you start to really throw bigger things, this here is probably already larger than 6 inches, but I'm talking about things that are 10 inches, some things that go up to your wrists or your elbows even. This is the point in which you really want to start to get a little smarter with the distribution of your water. At this point, you kind of need a sponge because the ability to put your hand in and out of the cylinder is gonna be a little bit rough. In some cases, whenever I throw things that are about 1.5 feet tall or maybe even 2 feet tall, I'm usually standing as I form them. Because of this, there's a couple of tricks that really help with the distribution of water, making sure that the inner and the outer of my cylinder is wet enough to make sure my next pull is sufficient. For this, and I'm sure many advanced potters have already figured this out, not only are you going to have to wet the inside of your cylinder as I showed you before, making that little claw hand, you're also going to have to wet some portion of your wrist or your arms. This makes sure that the dryness of your wrist and your arms, which are usually dry if you're working clean, only your hands should usually be wet. This makes sure that they hydroplane over your wrist, making sure that no friction is caused. So when you're throwing like this, see, my wrist is wet. Now it's not pulling on my wrist. Now I can do a nice long pull. And just as an example, I'm gonna make a really quick cup, but there's 3 things I want you to keep track of here. Number 1, whether I'm using my sponge to carry over a lot of water or not. Number 2, how much water I'm actually carrying over, whether I'm cupping my hand or not. And number 3, how many times I'm dipping my hands into this water bucket. You see, it's really not that difficult, and the high majority of the time, it's less of a how much water do I need to use in order to make X thing, and it's more of a, you don't really need as much water as you thought you needed. You can get really far with probably about 1/3 or even half of the water that you've been using this entire time. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I know this is kind of more of a beginner video. There's probably some more advanced people watching this going, that's not how I do things, but everyone applies water to their vessels and their centering a little bit differently. This is by no means the be-all, say-all, end-all video to what you should do with your water and how much you should use. It's really just a guideline video for beginners and showing them different techniques of how to place their water where they need it, when they need it, to get the most effective and less soggy product. You trust me, I know this from experience. If you work with it a little bit too long and you're not getting any real results out of it, it gets floppy after a while. I'm oversaturating my clay body just so I can show you how to not oversaturate your clay body. And because of it, there's a mess everywhere, and it's your fault, and I think you owe me a like button. Well, thank you, Potters, for joining me today. Hopefully this video helped you out a little bit in learning how much water to not put on your product. I imagine a lot of beginners are having issues with, like, my stuff is getting really soggy and I'm putting a lot of water on there and nothing's happening and the clay dries out too quick. I will say that there's a very small variable in the type of clay that you're using, because some clays are a little bit more water absorbent than others, especially if they have high grog content. But even those clays don't need as much water as you probably think they need, or at least they definitely don't need you to douse them with a sponge full of water every time. One hand in your bucket to make sure that it's nice and moist and you lubricate your entire cylinder or cone is plenty of. I know it sounds perverted, but that is the terminology and we gotta deal with it. Hopefully this video helped some of you out discover how much water you actually need on your cylinders and vessels in order to get that nice hydroplane effect. You have a great time with your next art project, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week.
Thank you for your patronage.
I'm oversaturating my clay body just so I can show you how to not oversaturate your clay body. And because of it, there's a mess everywhere, and it's your fault.